looking at our worldview, we're looking at the other worldview, and that's where incoherence and coherence, basic level contradictions, and basic level coherence comes into play, right? So when we're looking at the worldview that's positing something like, atheistic materialism, and when then we compare that to the metaphysic and the worldview, the ethic and the epistemology that we have, we see that these two systems, one of them, it's not that it can't answer some really deep questions. It can't even get off the ground. The atheistic materialistic one, for example, right? Because at a fundamental level, it cannot even begin to reason, to do logic, and to do epistemology. Not saying that this is another mistake people make. We're not saying that they don't do the disciplines. They do, but they don't do them coherently, or they're not able to justify how they can do it given their paradigm. That's the point. They
have no warrant or justification for their use of that, and it's not going to suffice to say that. And again, you've heard this argument made before, that I can use logic and I don't actually have to justify my use. For example, I can use a car without knowing how it works.
This is what Dillahunty said, right?
Yeah, big difference. Cars aren't making truth claims.
Right.
There's no verifiable. When you're using logic, even in the most basic sense of A is B, guess what you're doing? You're making an act of predication. And when you make an act of predication, A is B or belongs to B, you're making a veridical claim. And yes, guess what? You have to justify veridical claims. Why should that actually be about truth? You're using it as a truth device. If you're using it as a truth device, and you're using it normatively too, that you ought to believe
exactly.
This. Normativity and truth require justification, and that's exactly as presuppositionalists what we're going to attack. That you're using it. We know that. You may even get certain stuff done and accomplished and come to certain conclusions. You're unwarranted. Why? Because you have no justification.
That was a key point that I noticed in many of the comments on the debate with Dillahunty, for example, is that many of the atheists were just simply saying, why can't Matt just assert that these things are? And I kept trying to say that you have to give a justification, and what justification means is epistemic warrant. And we say that. Why do we? I want you to answer. Why do we say that? I would say it's because we don't want to believe in things that we can't make sense of. I mean, if Matt was a skeptic and the other skeptics were really skeptics, they would agree that you can't believe in things that we don't have warrant to believe in. So why do we have to justify our claims, and what does it mean to have epistemic warrant?
Yeah. So I mean, even in the question, let's see, how is it that you phrased it? Can't I just, isn't just logic just is? Isn't that, just ask the question, is what?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah,
logic.
Because that's an epistemic and a metaphysical claim that it has existence in some way. It is, right? Is a statement of either identity or predication or some metaphysical ontological grade or status.
Yeah, and is used for what? And again, I thought that it was good that you showed that, if you just say, well, I use it for this, or I just assume, again, you're committed to being arbitrary.
Yeah, that would be added too, right?
I mean, what if I use logic to wash my dishes, like logical formulas, or like in a way that typically, whatever you want to imagine, that people typically don't use logic. I use logic to logical propositions to brush my teeth or something like that. Is that the way it's supposed to be used? So it really doesn't do anything, the fact that you say, well, I can use it, it works and stuff like that.
When you say
because that's always a teleological claim that works for what end? And the end that you're choosing is arbitrary.
Exactly. It assumes a value judgment, right? To say that something has worked and therefore it has achieved its purpose assumes telos, and it assumes that's better than not working, right? We want the thing to work, and as opposed to not work. We want it to function. But functioning in that sense, again, assumes some positive outcome as opposed to an outcome that you don't want. And that would require a value judgment of saying, this one is good, I want this one, I don't want that one.
This is exactly where the naturalists have gone in epistemology. And, I talk about this with Quine, that Quine thinks that the old justificatory epistemology doesn't work and it should be thrown out. And primarily because his critique that there is no kind of cosmic exile from an outside position that can just look down purely objectively and make these kind of epistemic claims that everybody's embedded within and must do it within. And his critique of classical foundationalism is as well. And that, Quine is pointing out there that, well, what should we do? If epistemology is going out, as Jaegwon Kim says, the business of justification, well, what's left for epistemology? And he says it should be handed over, and you'll see his behavioralist influence, it should be handed over to psychology, in which we understand things as antecedent causes, which is the input, right, the behaviorist model, and the torrential output, which are our beliefs and propositions and whatnot, and that under the laws of mechanics and physics that we can study this. And what that commits him to is a form of reliabilism. So how do we study the subject epistemologically under the banner of psychology? Well, what you would find out, he says, is you'd study this experimental subject in a controlled environment and determine how many, when X antecedent cause produces this, how many more true beliefs than false beliefs? And therefore, X would be reliable if it produced more true beliefs than false beliefs. Which is moronic. But guess what? The same critique that we're making, that already assumes. And what works is, again, you're assuming some type of arbitrary goal.
The easy way to make this applicable is that I can create a giant super bomb that works really well to kill everybody. But does that mean that it's therefore the right thing to do to set off the super bomb? Because it works really well, right? I mean, that just is a stupid example that shows that something working, again, isn't pre-interpreted. Like, it requires a context to understand as to what that means and a paradigm. And it also, again, this is another point that I've tried to stress to a lot of people too, is that I believe it's impossible to make. This was the debate that I had ultimately with Vegan Gains and Ask Yourself, which was that it's impossible to make epistemic claims or logical claims that don't entail something to do with ethics or an ought, right? So if you believe in truth, as you were talking about in that example, I mean, theoretically, you could say I hold to true propositions, and we should hold to true propositions. But we once you say should, you've introduced the ought, and that was the whole debate that I had with that guy, because he wanted to have logical propositions without the should, without any connection to ethical norms, or that there's no logical force behind you having to accept what's true, but there is. Otherwise, the whole thing is stupid and pointless. If I don't have to,
and every epistemologist knows that epistemology entails normativity. That's why Quine is attempting to get rid of justificatory epistemology and hand it over to psychology, is because he thinks he's getting out of the normative problem. So it's the same thing. Obviously, Quine's much more sophisticated and actually presents some real arguments that we can work through. Yeah, not just a.
Well, and also at this point too, we want to point out that I had a point I was going to make about paradigms, and it just slipped my mind. That reduces to psychologism, and what's ironic is that psychologism was already promoted and argued against 100 years ago, because it's Brentano that influenced Husserl, and Brentano had the insight of intentionality that Husserl took. But then what happened was Husserl realized that Brentano and the guy after him, I forget his name, Ernst Mach, because
Ernest Mach.
Mach took that into total psychologism, and he was even making this stupid statement like that scientific truths are just psychologistic relativism. It's a really dumb idea. And then Husserl saw how stupid this was, and this is the great insight of the logical investigations. Although Husserl erroneously still thought that you could achieve total neutrality, which is where he's wrong, he was correct to understand and perfectly encapsulate how foolish and stupid it was to believe that science doesn't operate on abstract mathematical and logical principles. And that's what the logical investigation shows, is that there is a vast amount of logic and science that goes into the logic and mathematics and entailment and necessary, propositions and what follows in the scientific method itself.
Absolutely, yeah, and
so psychologism is stupid. It's been refuted many times over. And what happens, as you're pointing out, is that these guys, they see the dead end and then they just fall over. Well, what's the other option? Just scientism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of these things have been refuted. For example, how many times have you come across in debates somebody giving some naive logical empiricism?
Yeah, right.
That it's like nobody, or reductionism, the reductionist project of Carnap. There's no philosopher in the professional world that thinks those projects succeeded. They've been utter failures. Yeah. And it was great because all it took is kind of a meta-reflective question on, if the only true and meaningful statements are those empirically verified, what about that statement that the only true... Yeah, and guess what? The whole project, and you had some smarty pants there. You had Bertrand Russell, you had the whole Vienna School, right? The whole project came to a crash. And so this is one of the problems, too, you and I have talked about this, that because of the way the education model now is kind of compartmentalized, and you don't have a classic like liberal arts education, you have people studying specific fields that neither know the history of that particular discipline or its connection to all the other disciplines as well. And so you end up getting people making foolish statements and embarrassing themselves, not knowing that all of this has been refuted and nobody takes us seriously anymore.
Exactly.
Go get a great liberal arts education. That's what I would encourage.
Yeah, that was what was so great about the ancient and principally the medieval system, both in the East and the West, to be fair, was that whether it was Byzantium or whether it was the West, they at least understood the concept of the university, right? That all of the arts are under God because they're all aspects of his world. And this is why, famous saints in our tradition, Basil the Great, St. Photius the Great, they promoted and believed in a form of a broad-ranging classical education. So that there's nothing wrong with that, and it can be a good thing. It can be misused as anything can, because it's a tool, but there's nothing wrong with it. And it's absolutely that breakdown that you talked about when we get up to the modern philosophers like Descartes. That's when we start to see the breakdown. And